Hello, good evening, everybody. My name is Hannah Cram. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at SITE. And just before we begin our program today, I invite you to join me in acknowledging our presence on the unceded ancestral land of the Tewa people. At SITE Santa Fe, we recognize that a land acknowledgement is only one small part of supporting Indigenous people. Acknowledgement requires holding space for both the beauty and the pain of our shared histories, and supporting ongoing dialogue and storytelling that reflects our vibrant and diverse community. We invite you to join us in acknowledging and celebrating the many contributions that Indigenous people bring to our community, and we invite you to acknowledge our role as future ancestors and our responsibility to steward and care for this land, water, and air for future generations. I'll be brief up here. I just wanted to thank you guys all so much for being here today at SITE. 2025 is a huge year for us here at SITE. It's our 30th anniversary, which we're celebrating. And this summer, thank you. We're also going to be relaunching the International, which is going to be a really wonderful thing across city of Santa Fe. All of the announcements for those artists are happening next week, so take a look out for that if you're interested. We're really happy that you guys are here today, and we're really happy to host this event and to further our collaboration and relationship with the fabulous School for Advanced Research. And with that, I just pass it along to Morris Foster to get the program started for you guys. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Morris Foster. I'm the president of the School for Advanced Research. Welcome to today's Mellon Lecture, presented in partnership with our good friends from SITE Santa Fe. We are pleased tonight to present the 2017 MacArthur Foundation Fellow and former SAR Weatherhead Fellow, Jesmyn de León. In this talk, Jesmyn presents stories from his recent book, the 2024 National Book Award winning Soldiers and Kings, Survival and Hope in the World of Human Smuggling, and examines the complicated relationship among transnational gangs, the human smuggling industry, and migrant desires for safety and well-being. Jesmyn's work combines archaeology, ethnography, visual anthropology, and forensic science to examine migration, violence, and material culture. Jesmyn is the director of the Cotsen Institute of Archaeology and the Loyd E. Cotsen Endowed Chair of Archaeology at the University of California at Los Angeles, where he is also professor of anthropology and Chicano and Central American Studies. I want to thank some of our generous sponsors who have made this event possible. First, of course, the Mellon Foundation, which is our title sponsor. Then Anonymous, Patricia G. Foshi Charitable Trust, Adobo Catering, Andrea Fisher Fine Pottery, Flora Crichton Lecture Fund, Founders Society members, Ethel Jane Bunting Foundation, Thornburg Investment Management, Luke and Betty Vortman Endowment Fund, Dan Marians of UBS Financial Services, REW Wealth, Santa Fe Dining, and Shiprock Santa Fe. I'd also like to recognize the numerous members of our board of directors who are here tonight. Thank you for your continued commitment and support. Events like these are made possible by the generous support of our members and donors. If you would like information on becoming an SAR member, please visit our website at members.sarweb.org or stop by our memberships table at the back of the room and speak with Kat Bernhardt after the talk. At each of your seats, we also have our new events brochure that just came out today, and this has all of our events through into the summer, so we have a lot of things happening, so please take that with you. And finally, I'd like to remind you all to please silent your cell phones and other electronic devices at this time. And please welcome Jesmyn de León.
Thank you, Morris, for that very generous introduction. Just thank you all for having me here. I have a, as I was saying earlier, it took me about less than 2 hours to have a breakfast burrito with red chili sauce in my hand by the time I got here. So I love being in New Mexico. I love being in Santa Fe. I've had a very fortunate long history, both with SITE Santa Fe and with SAR, so I want to thank everyone for having me here. Although, we did an exhibition here in 2020 that was all happening kind of virtually. So this is actually my first time in this building. So I'm excited for that. And there's just a lot of friends and people who have supported this work over the years. So I just want to thank everyone, including Deborah Winslow, who I saw in the audience, who was really the first person to support this project many, many moons ago, when we had this crazy idea to try to use archaeology to understand undocumented migration along the U.S.-Mexico border. So I've been giving a lot of talks lately, and it's a weird time. I mean, people think that like it must be really great for work, and I'm like, it's where does one begin? And I'd been doing this talk recently where I was starting out with a story that I would tell about being at a Trump rally in 2016. And that actually had been a story that was taken out of Soldiers and Kings when we were on the final draft because it seemed sort of outdated. It felt like we were on the cusp of something new and positive. And so I brought it back in, and then I took it out again for this talk, at least most of it. And I think part of it was because I was sort of starting with this bizarre moment where I'm at a Trump rally in 2016 thinking that it's some fevered dream and that it's all going to go away very soon. And of course, that is not. But I think it's important in this moment as we're watching the world catch fire, and I'm from Los Angeles, and I've been living with wildfires in more recent times, but also the collapse of seemingly of American democracy and the dissolution of many federal agencies and pick your poison right now. But I think it's important for us to understand that that we're not alone in this, and I think we need to decenter the American perspective right now. I mean, it's hard to when. I mean, I can't even open the New York Times. I mean, I shouldn't have done it 20 minutes ago because I was like, oh God, we're sending Asian migrants to Panama. I mean, it's sort of craziness. But I do think it is important to understand that we have to take a step back. And, in November, I had many of my well-intentioned liberal neighbors coming to me and saying, well, where are we going to move to? Where are we going? And I said, you think there's a country in this world that's not experiencing an extreme swing to the right? I mean, it's everywhere. And so, what about Italy? No, there's no fascism there, right? So I think that we have to both find our own rhythm in dealing with the news cycle right now and figuring out where to put our energy. But also, I think, this is an argument that I've been making for a long time, is I think we need to take a step back, take a global perspective, and really try to understand what is happening on the ground just outside of our borders and everywhere else, so that we can better understand that this is not a problem to be solved in the United States alone. It's not a problem to be solved with border security. And so today I thought, instead of starting with this bizarre Trump rally, I thought we would start on the train tracks in southern Mexico, where I've spent quite a bit of time. And so I'll take you there. So imagine there's lots of reggaeton playing out of a cell phone, which I was going to do here, but I feel like we're going to blast you out of the room here. So lots of reggaeton playing. If you're hanging out with smugglers, there's always a lot of beer and marijuana, and so it's a kind of 24/7 party vibe. Except it's not much of a party because you're just hanging out in the woods or in the jungle, and you're waiting for something to happen. So let's go to a little place called Pacalna along the Guatemala-Mexico border. Pacalna in Chiapas, in Mexico, is a poem, a bloodletting, a roadside memorial, a wish. Its laughter echoing from inside a dark place. Blinding heat, clothes wet with jungle. Railroad ties shiny and smooth from a million frantic footsteps. It's the sun reflected off of sharpened metal. A rooster screaming. A man screaming. Hope and hopelessness. Desire and greed. Pacalna in Chiapas in Mexico is the center of migrant worlds that disappear only to remake themselves in new outlines and shadows. Look, kid, you're Mexican. This is what Papo tells him. You're from here. We're not. When you're older, you'll have the privilege of leaving Pacalna and crossing up to the border without worrying about getting deported before you even get there. So for now, fuck off. The boy, who is probably 6 or 7, stands firm. He doesn't want to leave. Get the fuck out of here, Papo yells. The kid is a statue, naked except for threadbare dress pants, whose frayed cuffs barely reach his ankles. He's a miniature Robinson Crusoe shipwrecked on these train tracks. He is poor even by migrant standards. He is immovable. Papo's jaw tenses and his scrawny, tattooed arms flex in anger. He pushes the boy to the ground and I flinch. The boy's 4-year-old brother looks at Papo with great concern. "We told you to get the fuck out of here," someone says. "Just go," Santos implores them. The boy stands back up and is now crying, but he holds firm. His little brother tugs at his arm. "These fucking children have no fear," Chino jokes. I try to intervene. I say, "Mira, papi, it's only because we're here talking about adult stuff. It's better if kids aren't around." The child gives me a blank look. Tears begin to fall. I awkwardly put my arm around his shoulder. He keeps crying and starts to hyperventilate. Alma, she just shakes her head. "Just give him 5 pesos so he will leave." She's cradling her own child, her 4-year-old daughter, Dulce. She tries to shoo the boy away. "Vaya, vaya." I put a thick Mexican coin in this kid's dirty hand. Papo takes a few aggressive steps toward the children. The boys turn and start heading south down the tracks. In unison, they step over piles of garbage that decorate the ground, as if following some unspoken choreography. The older boy puts his arm around his little brother as they disappear into the distance. How many years will pass before they turn around and start heading the other direction like so many children before them? Jason, don't worry about it. Let him go, Alma tells me as she puts her bleach blonde hair into a tight ponytail. These kids in Pacalna are too much. They're always here. They're always stealing food from us and hanging around. Every time we are drinking and smoking, that older kid is here. He even drinks caña, cane liquor. That's why I keep my daughter close and don't let her play with him. That fucking kid stole a bottle of tequila from us the other night, Papo yells. Oye, you better be nice to those children, Chino jokingly admonishes us. Because in a few years, they're going to be the new ones robbing us on the train tracks. We all laugh, knowing full well that it's true. Now, as that was happening, in southern Mexico in around 2015, 2016, when this project began, there were other things happening in the United States that were deeply connected, right? So the things that are happening in southern Mexico cannot be separated from the things that are happening in the United States along the U.S.-Mexico border and elsewhere. And I'll never forget, like I said, I went to this Trump rally in 2016 where Trump told everyone that there were thousands of people waiting to get in that could not. And so we should all feel very lucky to be in this tiny quarter-filled basketball gymnasium. And there was literally nobody in the parking lot except for a redneck doing donuts in the snow and the one black person selling Trump t-shirts. But everybody bought it up. Everybody, were like, of course it's full outside. Of course, this is, the things that people were being told they were very much believing, despite the fact that it was pure fantasy. And I think, we need to think about it in terms of the problem is not just I think it cannot be reduced to racism, I think, which is what we had been thinking about in 2016, this kind of anti-immigrant sentiment that was growing. It's a much bigger problem that we are facing globally. I think the climate change, the brutality of capitalism, misogyny, patriarchy, the long-term impacts of colonialism, this is all happening at once. And there's no formula at this point to, it cannot be reduced to race or any one of those categories. We have to think about this problem as an intersectional problem. But all that being said, I mean, where we are now, the things that are happening in this country in regards to the bluster about immigration security, about all these these crazy things that are going to supposedly start happening that are logistically impossible, right? The mass deportation of 12 million people, it's never going to happen, but it does make for good news fodder, and smugglers love it. And so right now, I mean, the smuggling industry is very much watching the Trump administration, and is very much, as they were in 2016, as I highlight in the book, making lots of money off of both the false promises of that administration, as well as just our continued desire in this country to need and to have so many of our industries be driven by undocumented labor. So, I'm sure that this will come up more in the Q&A, because someone here is going to ask me, well, how do we solve this problem? And so we'll see. I've been obviously asked that question a lot, and my answer gets longer and longer and more complicated, and less satisfactory. So just prepare yourself to be disappointed. So let's go into Honduras now, and I want you to meet some of the folks that I write about, and give you some background on this project. And so we're going to start in a place called San Pedro Sula, Honduras. Roberto's murder does not warrant much attention. And before I began this project, I didn't really know anyone directly who had been murdered. And after I came out of this project, I've come to know a lot of people that have been murdered. But his murder does not warrant much attention, which is totally not surprising in a place like Honduras, where homicide has become woven into the daily fabric of life. Still, a local paper in San Pedro Sula manages to give him 3 sentences. Well, they get his first name wrong. They called him Jose. His first name is Juan. They write, Jose Roberto Paredes. He died Friday night at Mario Rivas Hospital. Family members reported that he had tried to travel mojado illegally to the United States, but in Chiapas, Mexico, was stabbed during an assault and admitted to a hospital. After his discharge, he returned to Honduras, and a few days later, his condition worsened, and he was brought to Rivas Hospital, where he died after several days. Now, they get most of the basic details right. Roberto was in Mexico illegally when he was stabbed. He did later die in Honduras from those wounds. But he wasn't a migrant headed to the United States, at least not anymore. He'd given up that fantasy many years ago. And for the last few years, he'd been living as a street urchin, making money guiding his fellow Hondurans on the Mexican tracks as they made their way north toward the American dream. What he did for a modest living goes by many names in English and in Spanish. Smuggler, coyote, pollero, pasador. These are interchangeable terms that refer to a person who is paid to help someone get across a geopolitical boundary. Now, Roberto, like many in his situation in Mexico, preferred to call himself a guia, a guide. And this is a designation that potentially has less semantic baggage, and I think it's one that often more directly reflects the work that they're doing, the labor. He is the one that you follow, the one who could potentially lead you through danger. The one thing you cannot call Roberto, and if you take nothing from this talk, or at least just one thing, it's that human smuggling and human trafficking are different things. And so what you cannot call Roberto is a human trafficker. People who are trafficked have that happen against their will, through force, fraud, or coercion. The people that Roberto was smuggling, these were willing participants who sought him out and paid him for his services. I'll say it one more time. Human smuggler and human trafficker are very different things. That's a concept that the popular media and many of the general public often have a hard time understanding. And it's because we conflate them all the time. I literally did an interview the other day where I think I said to the person, yeah, this book, part of the message of this book is just helping people to understand the difference between human smuggling and human trafficking. And then they later introduced me as like, here's this author who spent all this time with human traffickers. And I says I can't win. I need a T-shirt that says, but the distinction is very, very important. It really is. Now, this is where the global perspective kind of starts to help us, right? Just turn the news on, and we can see that we are living in a worldwide migration crisis where poverty, political instability, climate change, these are forcing millions of people to leave their homes every year in search of a better existence. And the global rate at which this is growing, coupled with rising sea levels, increased drought, wildfires, flooding, and the appearance of environmental monsters like atmospheric flood. I don't know. I left LA and whatever new term they have for the torrential rainfall that's slamming the LA County right now, the super hurricanes that have been battering Honduras. You don't have to be a soothsayer to predict that things are about to get a lot worse for all of humanity. Now, of course, our response in the global north has been to harden our borders, right? As if border walls actually worked, if increased border security actually solved these problems, we would have solved these problems a long time ago. But these are great smokescreens. We can blame immigrants and migrants for every kind of societal ill, and they can deflect attention away from other things like where your tax dollars are going. So we harden borders. right? We pour money into detention complexes, the intention to deportation industrial complex, which I'm sure many folks in this current administration are making lots of money on, right? We can build barricades, we can fire tear gas and rubber bullets at mothers holding their babies, we can put children in cages, we can deny due process to asylum seekers, right? We can do all these things, and that's what we're doing. But history has shown us that border walls are no match for human determination and the will to live. Our species' ability to survive for over 200,000 years has been our ability to move across the landscape in search of new resources and new habitats. Human mobility cannot be stopped. The human spirit cannot be broken. But it sure feels like we're living in a dystopian novel or book. Right? And as we attempt to beat back migrants at our front door, like a scene from P.D. James's novel, The Children of Men, the human smuggling industry balloons. And sneaking people past border guards went from being a mom and pop operation to now $1 billion global industry. And this is only going to become more and more important as things get worse in different places. And as we ramp up security globally, migrants now need a new breed of smuggler who can provide safe passage and through this increasingly violent world of clandestine movement. This means you got to hire people who are willing to do whatever it takes to get those paying clients through a deadly gauntlet that now spans multiple countries. This is a gauntlet characterized by extreme environments, transnational gangs, drug cartels, law enforcement looking to profit and or impede people's journeys. And these days, the low-level smugglers that I spend a lot of time with, they have a lot in common with their clients. They're all trying to escape poverty and the now unlivable places they once called home. And so this kid, Roberto, the guia, he was a tiny cog in the behemoth economy of human smuggling. The media often portrays people like him as the, quote, bad guys who prey on the innocent. But the story is not that simple. Arrest and deportation by law enforcement, robbery, kidnapping, extortion, and murder at the hands of transnational organizations, these are the things that migrants increasingly face. Many have come to see the labor of folks like Roberto as both necessary and sometimes life-saving. This does not mean that these guides cannot also be thieves, traffickers, murderers, and rapists. They can potentially be all of those things and then some. And that becomes apparent as the story unfolds. But people create contracts with these smugglers because they give them the benefit of the doubt that no matter what happens, they will eventually get to their final destination, even if it involves hardship and shelling out more cash than was initially agreed upon. And all migrants have heard the stories about evil smugglers doing terrible things, and many of them have had their own terrible firsthand experiences. But still, they make these contracts with folks in good faith with the hope that these folks will be protectors, and they will not rob them, sell them into slavery, or abandon them in the jungle, the desert, or the back of a semi-truck. There are just enough good smugglers in the world for this economy to keep moving, to keep functioning, even with the constant risk of things going bad at some point. Now, in Western imagination, these smugglers are usually pot-bellied Latinos with silver-capped teeth and slick hair. They reek of cologne. They drive shiny trucks, right? These are trucks bought with the hard-earned or mostly borrowed money of desperate people trying to get to La USA, the United States. Roberto defied these stereotypes. He was a skinny, banged-up kid from Honduras who was often homeless and living hand-to-mouth. He rarely had more than $20 to his name and was often more desperate than his clients. He knew how to guide people on the train tracks because he'd come of age in that dreadful place. He never saw huge piles of money. He never got to drive a car. He was not a kingpin or someone who called the shots. There was nothing glamorous about his lifestyle or his brutally short existence. His modest grave is marked by a wrought iron plaque that bears his name, his birthday, and his date of death. And somehow, the engraver, who had one job, managed to get his last day on Earth incorrect. But many would say, hey, it doesn't even matter, right? To most people, Roberto is a nobody, just another young man from Honduras with a history of substance abuse and violent behavior, someone destined for an early grave. And cemeteries across Central America are full of skeletons of people just like him. Children born into generational poverty, whose bleak futures are predetermined before they can even speak. Kids who live fast and die fast because those are often the only choices they are given. Roberto is one of those kids. but he is not a nobody. He's a young person with dreams and aspirations who carries hope with him until the very end. He is important enough that people will wail at his funeral and pray for his soul. Someone will scratch "I love you" in the wet concrete that is poured over the top of his tomb. I will come to know Roberto as a soldier on the train tracks trying to survive in Mexico. He confides in me that he wants to get out of the smuggling game. It's gotten out of control. Death is breathing down his neck. He wants to run away and reinvent a life for himself that doesn't include guns or knives or desperate people doing desperate things. But that is not how this story, like many I will learn and write about, will end. As I sit on his grave in rural Honduras, I ponder the surrounding lush countryside. It's an awe-inspiring landscape, but it's one that holds no future for so many people who must head north and roll the dice. Migrants who will follow the train tracks across Mexico and pray that whatever is waiting for them at the end of the line, it has to be better than the cruel hardships and early death that they are running from in Honduras. This project, this book, is about Roberto and others like him who get caught up in the smuggling industry. People on the train tracks who go by 1,000 nicknames: Kingston, Flaco, Alma, Papo, Chino, Santos. People whose birth names are often mysteries until the very end when they are inscribed on the tombstones. In Soldiers and Kings, I really try to explore the lives of these smugglers and their intimate relationships with death. These destitute men and women who find themselves trapped in a world of violence and fast money while in search of hope. A world of guias, a world of guides who have no one to lead them to safety except maybe themselves. And so this talk is a brief and admittedly unsatisfactory journey down those train tracks. So we're going to try to condense 400 pages, about 120,000 words into 50 minutes. I'm just kidding. So I'm just going to give you some, as best I can. And so, this book, which came out last year, it's been a real roller coaster of a ride, which I'm happy to talk about more. Just like as a writer, it's a very lonely, scary process, and then you put something out in the world, and I think if you try to write really honestly about yourself and about your experiences, for me, that it feels really good in the moment, and then it's also super terrifying when people come up to me and go, "So, you're that fucked up, huh?" Like, and you're like, "Oh God!" Like, but this book has been a really quite a humbling experience, and I feel very, very honored to be able to talk about the lives of these folks who fundamentally changed me in a lot of ways. And so this book came out in 2015 and really was an attempt for me to write for a public audience, to try to get people to think about migration in a different way. The book itself revolves around kind of sort of six major folks, three of whom I will introduce you to briefly today. And the book is about smuggling. Right, it's got smuggling in the title. It's kind of like drag you in, and people, the salacious title, and oh yeah, and then it's really, but haha, it's about capitalism, racism, climate change. It's about all, it's like my wife sneaking in the vegetables into the pasta sauce, so my kids and I don't know what we're doing, what we're eating. But it really is trying to get you to think about smuggling as this much bigger thing, as a symptom of all of these issues. And as I think I'll talk about a little today, and definitely go into much more depth in the book, it's really about the difficulties of doing this type of research, the commitment that one creates on a personal level, trying to understand the lives of folks over many, many years. And so I explore that a bit. And also just trying to explain to people who anthropologists are, what we do. I think it's oftentimes a mystery. We're not very good at explaining ourselves. I tried to use this term, which is in the vernacular of deep hanging out. Which, like the New York Times just thought it like meant I didn't do any work, and my wife used to joke that this was my hang out on the train tracks and drink beer project, which it was. But that's, for me, this is part of the work. It's a long-term time commitment to understanding these things, and it really is. It's hanging out and trying to get a sense of so many things that are happening in people's lives. So we'll get into that a little bit today. The question is always put to me, like, why write about smuggling? And I'll just give you a couple of quick reasons here. One is, it's a crucial part of this process that is always kind of overlooked, ignored. We rarely talk about smuggling unless something really bad happens, which happens often. But more often than not, people are getting moved from one place to another, and we're missing a lot of information about that. So I really wanted to understand this process, or this part of the process. And my first book, sorry, I had this picture. My first book really focused on the migrant experience, and I felt like in the Land of Open Graves, smugglers were the elephant in the room that I just didn't ever have enough time to talk to. And so this was an attempt to shift and to think about that. And as I said, it's a $1 billion industry, and doing a book on the bad guys, on the bad people in this, I hoped would force me to think about this in a new way and would teach me some new things. And it really did. And so I had to go into this project with a new set of commitments about trying to write about these folks who are very much involved in the exploitation of so many people. And so hopefully, I think I learned something new, and I hope that the public does too. I just want to give you a quick little historical backdrop before I go back to the train tracks here. When this project began in 2014, this was right around the time when we were seeing all these kids from Central America, especially Honduras, were showing up at the U.S.-Mexico border. People were like, "Oh my God, I can't believe these kids are in detention centers. It looks so terrible." And also, "Oh my God, where's Honduras? What part of Mexico is that in?" Right? Like for a very brief moment, we thought about Honduras, and I joked with the folks at Viking when we were coming up with the talk titles. They said, "Should we put Honduras in the book title?" I said, "You should only put Honduras in the book title if you want no one to buy this book, because nobody cares about Honduras, unfortunately. Despite the fact that Honduras has played such a crucial role in American history, we have been monkeying with their politics and their economy for a long time. And they also, I think, unfortunately, have become a laboratory to understand things like the relationship between climate change and migration. So when I began this project, all these kids were fleeing Honduras, and the U.S. was just starting a new program with Mexico called Plan Frontera Sur, Programa Frontera Sur, which was basically us forcing Mexico to stop the flow of migrants from Central America before they got to our border. And so we started training more people there. We started putting money towards infrastructure. I spent a lot of time with Border Patrol in Mexico City, who were training Mexican agents. I spent time with Border Patrol in Honduras, who were training those folks to catch their own citizens. And so as that's happening, of course, the smuggling industry starts to balloon. You see a steep rise in corruption. Things start to get more dangerous and expensive. The cartels start to get more involved now because they recognize they can start charging head taxes on these things. So it just creates a full-blown mess, and it's very much a mess driven by the United States. And the thinking is, much like what happens in the Arizona desert, is if you die out in the desert, that's nature's fault, even if the United States has tried very hard to put you in harm's way. If you die in the jungles of southern Mexico, that's the jungle's fault, or Mexico's fault, or your fault for going into the jungle, even though they are working very hard to make that the path of least resistance. And we're trying to force people into those places in hopes that nature or someone else will do the dirty work. And that's really, that's consistently happening globally now. I mean, whether it's the Mediterranean, where it's the Indian Ocean, we're seeing lots of different countries employ these indirect strategies of enforcement. And so when this project began, it was really in southern Mexico on the Guatemala border, trying to understand how these U.S. things that were happening in other places were really impacting immigration flows and people's experiences on the ground. So let's go back to Pacalna, back to Chiapas, and I want to introduce you to Chino, who you kind of met in the very beginning of this talk when he says, "Don't laugh at those kids, man, because they're gonna be the ones tomorrow who are gonna be chasing us." Okay, so let's go to the train tracks. The lead engine, it lurches 50 feet forward, stops, and then reverses, slamming hard into the car behind it. Grinding metal and screeching engine brakes compete with roosters and tropical birds. The train heaves forward and once again reverses and slams backward. This process keeps repeating, adding more rail cars each time. Chino is 15 feet above us. He's stoned out of his mind and giggling as he leaps from one car to another. He's a third world Peter Pan in knockoff Crocs, dancing for an audience of locals, migrants, and me. He hams it up, waving and grinning, and then sprinting across 3 moving cars in a matter of seconds. He stops just at the edge of the lead car, and then doubles back, mimicking the movement of this train. A couple of times as I watch this, I'm thinking he's gonna go flying. His momentum will be too much, and he's gonna go crashing down to the train tracks. This is a dangerous stupid, and entertainingly juvenile game that allows him to show off for the crowd and remind people, especially these migrants who might want to hire him for his services, that he is nuts and not to be fucked with, and he will do whatever is needed to get you through the gauntlet of southern Mexico. Now, as I sit there with him, I remember myself at his age doing equally dangerous and irresponsible things to entertain my friends. So I teach at UCLA now, which is where I went to undergrad, and so I can remember myself half a mile from my office in Westwood, dangling from a third-story roof, drunk and high on Vicodin, putting a half stick of dynamite in my mouth, sitting on my couch, and then accidentally lighting it because I'm pretending that it's a cigar, pushing a 500-pound dumpster down a steep hill and then running in front of it to recreate a scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark. In college, I never drunkenly ran across the top of a moving train. This is probably because I did not have access to a moving train. Now, on the surface, these shenanigans were mischievous at best and irresponsibly dangerous at worst. I thought of my behavior at the time as simply the kind of jackass things that young people do for kicks. Shit to make people laugh, which they often did and still do. But deep down, though, I've come to realize over the years that this was me trying to fill a hollowness that lived inside of me and that oftentimes continues to live inside of me. A darkness that manifested itself in bouts of crippling depression, intense feelings of isolation and rage, and a playful death wish that loomed over my teenage years and my early 20s. People have asked me over the years, how could you spend so much time with these smugglers whose lives are dominated by risk and creeping death? It's because it feels strangely familiar. I don't know what it's like to rob or kill someone, but I know what it's like to want to live fast and die. For many years, it felt like hints of death were the only things that could make me feel alive. Something that I've come to know as a parasuicidal behavior. Thank you to my therapist for helping me to figure that one out. But this is one of the reasons that I've learned over the years. That's why I get along so well with people like Chino and these other folks. We are long lost kin, bonded by childhood trauma, bonded by being survivors of childhood sexual abuse, intense emotional abuse. These things have connected me to these young people in more ways that I even want to sometimes understand. We are long lost kin, bonded in so many different ways, and we share this long history of dangerous self-medicating and self-harm. So I see myself, my adolescent self, in his youthful recklessness, in his embrace of death, a life where death is something to be taunted and almost welcomed. The death wish that I had to overcome and my own lifelong struggles with complex PTSD, they seem to give me some privileged insight into Chino's worldview, as well as that of many other men. It's mostly men that I come to write about, that I will get to know in the world of smuggling. Now, as I watch him foolishly play on top of a moving train, I think about a cynical line from Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, when Addie, the matriarch of the Bundren family, from her grave says, "The reason for living was to get ready to stay dead a long time." But then I think, what if the reason for dying is to know that you were once alive? It takes some coaxing, but Chino finally comes down from the top of the train. We shelter under a palapa that someone has erected next to the tracks, and we try to hide from the sun and pretend that the heat is not smothering us. He picks up a stick and starts scratching out a map of the train tracks in the dirt. He starts rattling off names of towns like a poem: Tapachula, Benamerito, Palenque, Corozal, Ixtepec, Tierra Blanca, Tenosique, Lecheria, Salto de Agua, Coatzacoalcos. This uneducated young man has an advanced degree in Mexican geography. Places to avoid, he knows places where a church might open its doors, places where teenagers with machetes and no patience collect $100 head taxes. Survival out here on the tracks is a knowledge game with a very steep learning curve. Chino speaks of a violent world of cycles and with no viable end in sight. He says to me, "Man, I spent a lot of time on the train coming and going. Sometimes they grab you at a checkpoint, and they send you back to Honduras. So you try again, and they catch you again. So you avoid those places the next time. You don't go through there. You keep trying new routes. He says it's simple. Immigration gets tougher, and we invent new routes. Well, how many times have you tried to cross Mexico, I ask. He says, maybe 5 times. I got as far as Laredo, Texas. I said, well, did immigration catch you crossing the border? No, I got across. I ended up living in a tree. I found some plywood and I climbed up into that tree with it. I made my little bed. I had some branches and some rope. I tied my stuff up there so I wouldn't fall out. He says, I was living in my little house with my cigarettes. I stayed up there at night. He said, I spent like 8 days sleeping in a fucking tree. He said, immigration would show up looking for me, but they couldn't see Chino. Chino was up in his little house. And Chino loves to talk about himself in the third person. He says, it was easy. They couldn't find Chino. And then they caught Chino coming out of a 7-Eleven. So they were watching me as I left the store, and they stopped and asked where I was from. I told them I was headed home, but they knew I was undocumented because of how I talked. And Chino loves to convince me that he can pass for Mexican, despite the fact that he has the thickest Honduran accent. He is wearing a belt buckle that has the Honduran flag on it. He has a wallet that has the Honduran flag on it. He has a tattoo that has 5 stars representing the Honduran flag, and then on another arm he has the word catracho, which is slang for Honduran, tattooed in giant letters on his arm. And I was like, Chino, we got to work on this disguise, my friend. So I said, well, how long are you in the States for? He goes, oh man, like a month. He said, but the problem is that you get there, and then what? Where are you going to go? He said, you just end up on the streets. And he's like a lot of kids who are leaving Honduras. They leave in the middle of the night. They're being chased out by gangs. They have no one to receive them on the other end. They have no place to go. And so there's no support network. There's no social network. They get to the States and they're wandering around going, well, now what? And so they end up back in Mexico, in this kind of permanent state of movement. So I said, well, how old were you the first time you left and went to Mexico? He said, 16. Just kept getting deported and get sent back, and I just keep coming back. And then I said, well, why leave in the first place? Gangs, problems. They murdered his best friend. He says, there were too many mouths to feed in my house. I told my mom I didn't want to be another burden to her, so I left. He said, my friend said, it's pretty good in Mexico. There's work. He's like, man, that guy was lying. It's like, it's hard in Mexico. No one wants to hire you because you're undocumented. The money sucks, although now it's looking a lot like the United States with this growing underclass of people, this growing undocumented labor force in Mexico that's getting paid subpar wages in that country. It's starting to look a lot like the United States. He keeps sketching out this map in the dirt. It shows the border with Guatemala to the south and Mexico City and Laredo to the north. This map that he draws me covers thousands of square miles. Chino knows dozens of cities, towns, and villages, but his view from them is tethered to the tracks. He never sees that all these places have to offer. It's like he's looking at the world through storefront windows. All right, I'm going a little long here, so I might skip ahead. Okay. Well, let's just try it. If I go a little long, I'll speed through here. I feel like I want you to meet someone else. Let's meet Santos. The sun, the Sonoran sun, is disorienting and it is merciless. Santos thinks that they're headed in the right direction, but it's only because he puts faith in this Mexican who's leading this train of drug mules. Days into this exhausting journey, he's questioning his decision to come. Still, carrying drugs on his back will cover his border crossing fees all the way up to Phoenix. Alone, he could never come up with the $5,000 needed to pay a coyote. And that's cheap. Nowadays, it might cost you $10,000 to get across the length of Mexico, not even to the United States yet. He is suspicious of this person, but he knows the drill. Santos is only 18, and he's already had several years of experience leading his own groups of migrants through the jungles of southern Mexico. He didn't set out to be a drug mule, and yet here he is in the desert, putting one sluggish foot in front of the other. He's quietly praying for a future job that doesn't involve doing this type of work. His daydream is shattered by the voice of a young kid, pathetic voice, the only other Honduran in this group. the voice of a kid who's just fallen to the ground. Give me 5 minutes, the kid begs. Fuck you, hurry up, the guide barks. The knife that the guide pulls from his pocket is chipped and rust-stained, with craggy teeth like a child's drawing of a monster. You get up now, or you're going to get 2 puñalazos, and then I'll leave you here to die. Leave him alone, Santos commands. Why do you care? Look, if you're going to do this to him, how do I know you won't do it to me too? Sorry, I missed that slide here. Santos unties these ropes that are cinched around his shoulders and his chest, and 55 pounds of hard-packed marijuana makes a dull thump as it hits the dirt. The kid that he is with starts vomiting foam. Let's go, someone yells. Look at him, he can't walk, Santos explains. The guide says, if I get caught, I will find you in Mexico and I will kill you. Kill whoever you want, Santos says, but I'm staying here. Please don't leave me, this kid begs. After more arguing, the group relents and tells everyone to hide their packs. Men in this group now, they all lie beneath gnarled mesquite trees that offer little respite from the violent midday sun. They contemplate their futures in this desert where thousands have died. This is Arizona. We don't have good data for New Mexico, but it's starting to look like this. And this is because since at least 1994, the U.S. Border Patrol have been using a strategy known as prevention through deterrence that purposely funnels people out into the remote parts of the southern U.S. border in hopes that this hostile terrain, and that's their language, will act as a weapon against migrants. In Arizona alone, more than 4,400 sets of human remains have been found, and I would argue that you could double that number for Arizona alone. So as they sit there, this kid sips water and tries to slow his pounding chest. His skin is cold, and he wonders, how can he be freezing in this heat? That's hyperthermia, my friend. Around him, men in camouflage clothes are scattered about in similar positions of uneasy repose. For hours, they chase shade and pretend that an escape from the heat is possible. Santos thinks about his mother. He imagines how she would feel if he never walked out of this desert. The sky blackens and night brings on a temporary sense of stillness. And these are photos taken by migrants with disposable film cameras in the desert. One of the Mexicans in the group passes him a lit cigarette and starts speaking to Santos. He says, you don't have what it takes to be a guide out here. He says, well, why is that? You're too soft, bro. This job requires that you do bad things. People die out here. If you don't threaten them, they won't keep going. Santos opens his mouth and releases a cloud of dry smoke into the Sonoran desert air. He says, I think you're right. I'm not built for this. Let's go back in time. A tiny Honduran village where a child watches the body of his father being lowered into a void of dark soil. 2 years later, that child, barely 13, walks north out of that village and never looks back. Juvenile and malnourished, Santos enters these surreal worlds in Mexico that are built on violence. Rail yards inhabited by soot-faced men crazed with drink and sex. Jungles dense with animals of all species, including predators armed with machetes and the rejection of mercy that comes from having no witnesses. This child memorizes this perverse landscape while trying to not let it devour him. He begs, he borrows, and he steals to stay alive. Santos comes of age alone with increasingly vague notions about what it means to have a home and what it means to live. When he finally approaches the gangsters who control the train tracks, asking for work, he's already a hardened soldier who can follow orders. He's been out here on the tracks for years and understands, like Chino, what it's like to be a failed migrant. He's had shit luck getting to America, but he's an expert now at clandestine movement. These gangsters give him instructions and a handful of migrants. Get these folks to Celaya, they tell him. Someone will be waiting for you. This is the job he's been training for his whole life. He helps his clients onto a train somewhere in the jungles of Chiapas, and a week later, his people are tired and they are hungry, but they are safe in Celaya. They jump into a vehicle and someone hands him $400. In the years to come, he will keep doing this more and more until he can save up enough money and get sick of this whole process and decide that he will carry marijuana on his back in hopes of paying for his passage toward the American dream. His experience as a drug mule out there in the woods, in the desert, they have forced him to examine what he is willing to do or not do to survive. He takes solace that he did not leave that kid in the desert to die. He also didn't lose any part of himself to greed or selfishness. He thinks it's okay because he soon finds that life in Phoenix brings a newfound sense of tranquility. He rents a room. He sleeps on a real bed. He finds pride in steady employment. Building houses in the suffocating Arizona heat is rough, but the $180 he can sometimes make in a day is more than he'd make in a month cutting sugarcane in Honduras. One day, while driving to a job in Tucson, his boss makes a lane change without signaling. They are pulled over, and he is soon on an airplane flying back to Honduras. His village is different after so many years away. MS-13 now rules that community with impunity. They want him to extort money from his friends, his family, and his neighbors. He refuses like he always has, and so they give him an ultimatum. Join us, leave, or die. He has spent his entire life trying to not do these bad things. He knows it's a dead end. Once again, he escapes from home, and he is soon back in Mexico helping migrants through a maze of dangers. Okay, let's meet one more person. Jesmyn. A metallic groan signals that there is an iron monster emerging from the forest. With an ancient machine gun across his chest, the guard glares down at us from the bow of the train like a figurehead trying to ward off evil spirits on the tracks. Chino leans in and looks toward Pakalna, the train coming with just a few feet of his head. He turns and grins, and he passes Jesmyn a blunt. She takes several deliberate hits and smirks as dagger-shaped smoke escapes from her mouth and disappears into the jungle like a fleeing premonition. In her pink Heartbreaker t-shirt and quiet way, Jesmyn seems out of place among this company of petty smugglers and low-budget hustlers. Barely 20 years old and barely 5'2", she doesn't intimidate, but it is clear that she can hold her own. Her dark eyes coolly take stock of everyone and everything around her. These men with peach fuzz jawlines and bad attitudes and gunshot scars and wound and other kinds of machete scars, they don't impress her much. And I remember asking her once, I said, "Are you scared to be out here?" She said, "I am from the most dangerous neighborhood in San Pedro Sula. Mexico is like a vacation to me." And I said, "Well, that's good because I am scared shitless, and I'm glad that someone here is not." She's only been in Pakalna for a couple of days at this point when I meet her. She's worked her way up from Guatemala with the group of migrants and smugglers that she met at the border. And this group included Chino and Santos. Those guys had gone south to help a man that they call Shadow transport several Honduran women north. Jesmyn tags along with Chino after he promises her safe passage for at least a few hundred kilometers. It helps that she thinks he's good looking. This is supposed to be a pit stop on the way to the United States. Instead, she finds herself stranded for almost a month, trying to save up enough money to pay for the next passage, the next leg of the journey. So she falls in with Chino and Santos and others who are all waiting for the right time to move. She knows that this place is dangerous, and she knows that women suffer in more ways than men could ever imagine on the migrant trail. And yet, in many ways, she defies all the stereotypes of the female migrant. And I think that it's important to try to understand the diversity of the experiences that people have, and just exactly what those folks are running from. For me, the story about Jesmyn became interesting because of her bond with Chino. And I love that she constantly reminded me, she's like, a lot of these women will align themselves with these dirtbags because they think they need protection. She's like, I don't need anyone's protection. I just think he's cute. And so it ends up being a love story more than anything else. Okay, so I've introduced you to Chino, I've introduced you to Santos, I've introduced you to Jesmyn, and then now let's put them all in the same room. Fast forward a few weeks after I meet Jesmyn and she's been hanging out with Chino on the tracks. The two of them are looking quite rough. She's been wearing the same clothes for several days, and the dark circles under her eyes, they signal that things are not good. They've been sleeping on a concrete patio just a few feet from the train tracks, and they're exhausted. And yet, in this moment in Pakalna, there's a melody of chirping birds that fills the jungle air. This place feels peaceful for a brief moment, except when that train thunderously clacks as it adds new cars in preparation for departure. On this particular day, Chino is really talkative, but also kind of relaxed, more relaxed than normal. He's someone who paces and he's very, very animated. And this is oftentimes because he's been snorting methamphetamines or smoking methamphetamines and drinking, and he's a wild guy. He's not running on the tops of trains right now. He's not taking enthusiastic slugs from a jug of cane liquor. Even the fingers on his hand, which often twitch from intense machete damage, have somehow been quieted. It's clear on this particular day, as I'm with him and Jesmyn, that something has happened, that he is changing. He's starting to contemplate a different kind of life, and it's a life that includes Jesmyn. He says, I might stay in Pakalna. We're thinking about renting a room and finding some work. Or maybe we'll go to Guatemala. I hear there's some good jobs there. These statements catch me off guard because just a few weeks earlier, he was running around like a maniac, running around the tops of freight trains, talking about drinking bleach as a way to escape his troubled life. And then now he seems clear-headed and optimistic about the future. I listen in slight belief as he speaks nervously about finding normal employment. He puts his arm around Jesmyn and she blushes and tries to cover up her smile with her hand. They're clearly smitten with each other. It's love at first sight on the migrant trail. As we sit and listen to birds and the clanging of train cars, I wonder, maybe this is how he gets out. After so many years of hard luck and bad decisions, someone has crossed Chino's path and offered a new direction. But can it be this simple? Can they just start over? Can they make a life for themselves that doesn't involve sleeping on the ground or running scared from machete attacks? Maybe together they will feel no longer restless or abandoned. The birds continue to chirp all around us, and for a moment, the train tracks feel like a place of optimism. I'm going to show you a quick little video of Chino. This is from a documentary that we did in 2019 called Border South, and here is an interview with Chino.
Por la primera vez que me vine para acá fue por amigos pues que lo dicen a uno, vamos allá, que bla, bla, bla. Que está bien por acá y la planeta pues también está cabrón pues. Por todos lados. Con esto es un disparo y un machetazo con machete. Uno quiere superar ya mejor.
¿Y ahora cuáles son tus planes para el futuro entonces?
Tratar de conquistar el mundo, como decimos, ¿no?
¿Qué vas a hacer cuando lo conquistes?
Ya estabilizarme. No, está difícil pues. Pues como anda en otro lugar, la verdad uno no puede decir qué es lo que va a suceder, sino que lo que Dios disponga, pues. Lo que Dios diga, eso es lo que va a suceder, porque no se sabe, pues. No se sabe.
A few days after this, a few days after that video was shot, I have to go back to, at the time, University of Michigan to go teach classes, which is always a strange feeling of like, you go from the train tracks and now I've got to stand in front of a room of students and try to explain what anthropology is. And that's a very, very disorienting movement, and one that makes my own privilege hyper visible. We decide to throw a party though to celebrate, and I can't tell if we're celebrating my end of summer field work or if these guys are celebrating that I'm leaving and then they'll no longer have an anthropologist following them around, recording everything and asking them the same stupid questions over and over and over again. But we decide, okay, we're gonna have a party on the tracks, and we have bottle openers and other stuff, but this always seemed to be the preferred method. And I kept trying to learn how to do this, and my wife was like, "You have spent so much money on dental work for you that I don't want to hear about. I don't know, no. This is actually hard to do." um, so we decided to have a party on the train tracks, and here we are. So this is kind of this end moment here. Music is playing from a cell phone at this Los Tigres del Norte. Things are, people are smoking weed, drinking beer, doing all the stuff that people do to pass the time out here. The party is in full swing when Chino and Jesmyn come walking towards us on the tracks. The two of them, they're giddy and they're holding hands as new lovers do. Chino starts telling us terrible jokes. Jesmyn laughs at them because she's polite and likes him. He's beaming and she's relaxed and seemingly less on guard. Things are good for a moment. We dance and we talk shit until our sides hurt from laughing. A couple of hours into this party, Chino pulls me aside and he says, "I have to tell you something. Something bad has happened with Shadow, the MS-13 smuggler that he went down south with to pick some people up with." The idea was that they were going to take this group of people, now including Jesmyn, and move them north. But Chino and Jesmyn falling in love has complicated matters. He says to me, "Chino, Shadow and Santos started getting ready to leave this morning, and they were saying to Jesmyn, it's time to go. He had her bags in his hand and was trying to force her to go with him. But she didn't want to go, and I said, we're not going. I'm not taking her. We are leaving. He got really pissed. He said he would kill me if I didn't follow his orders. But I didn't want to go. I just didn't want to do it. And I said, well, what did Santos say? Santos said I should go with them because it's not smart to disobey orders. When I told him I wasn't going, he said that I needed to get out of Pakal not now. He's my friend, and he knows that it's no longer safe for me here. And I said, well, why didn't you want to leave with Shadow? What would have happened? He said, that guy's two-faced. You got to understand that, Jason. Those girls he's traveling with, they're worth a lot of money. He told them he was going to smuggle them, but he's actually trying to traffic them. He wants to take them to a brothel and sell them. He knows that I knew that, and I wasn't going to go along with it. So that's why he got mad. But I said to him, how could you do that to your own people? But I couldn't do it. And I said, but now that's dangerous, right? You can't disobey a gang order. He says, yeah, now they're going to come after me. Gang law says that if I disobey orders, I cannot stay here. So now I'm worried that they're going to come after me. A lot of people here work for him. And then he points to a kid down the train tracks and says, that kid has been wanting to fight me for a long time. And now I have no protection. And he can come after me whenever he wants. He said, if I go south, they'll look for me there. If I go north, they'll look for me there. If I turn myself into the police, I'll go to detention, and people will know that I'm in a gang. They'll find out my name, and they'll know that I disobeyed an order. I said, I don't know where to go. He said, but I'm young, though, and I still want to get my life together. He says, I told Jesmyn, let's just get out of here and fight for a better future. I told her, I don't care where we go. I'll go any place, even if I'm only earning $5 a day. But in order to leave this life, I have to get off the tracks. I don't know if something bad is going to happen to me down the road, he says. But I do know that I don't want to be involved in this anymore. But like they say, once you get mixed up in this stuff, you can't get out. Despite the fact that he's been drinking and smoking, he comes across as sober and serious in this conversation. He's not the same kid that I watched drunkenly run across the tops of moving train cars. He's not running full speed towards self-annihilation. His eyes are now open to an escape into a world of possibilities. He thinks that his moral compass can guide him on a better path. After this conversation, the party takes a dark turn. It's hard to celebrate knowing what is at stake for Chino and Jesmyn. He says to me, this is a test. I could have either gone with Shadow or I could leave with Jesmyn. He said going with him would be easy. Leaving with her, that's the hard thing. That's the test. I look around at this group of people now, these smugglers, and I start to think about the potential for violence that's always been bubbling under the surface. Chino leans into me and says, there's a church up the street in the town of Palenque. Maybe they can help me there. So we get in the car and go. The windows are rolled down to let the hot jungle air pass through the car. The sun begins to disappear to the west. In the side mirror, I can see Jesmyn's head leaning out the car. her dark, curly hair floating in the wind as she takes in the sights between Pacalna and the tourist town of Palenque. There are signs everywhere advertising discount rates for hotels that have swimming pools and Wi-Fi. Hand-painted billboards with offers for private tours of the nearby archaeological site. We pass an immigration van with the weary faces of migrants staring back at us through the vehicle's barred glass. People looking at us on the road. I wonder, is it safer in there than it is out here? I think about my options for helping Chino. What do? Do I bring him to my house? Do I drive him to some other town and rent him a room? But where? How far is far enough to be safe from Shadow and his people? Or do I just shove money at him and say, figure it out? We drive endlessly through the narrow cobblestone streets of Palenque looking for a place that will take in migrants. But Chino's scared, he's indecisive, he doesn't want to get out of the car. We finally find this church, and there are a few people lingering outside. They say the priest is not in, but come back later. Maybe he'll let you stay. We pass Palenque's central plaza, and if any of you have ever been to the archaeological site of Palenque, it's like one of the most visited archaeological sites in all of Mexico. Pacalna is about 7-8 kilometers from Palenque. It's the other side of the tracks, and those worlds could not be farther apart. And if you're a migrant, you can't go into Palenque without really getting arrested because they don't want migrants mingling with the tourists. And so for us to be there in the car driving through it's kind of a big deal to be able to see the stuff that they've just heard about. And so we drive through Palenque and we pass the central plaza. I can see couples the same age as Jesmyn and Chino embracing under brilliant white gazebos. Children are devouring melting ice cream cones and chasing pigeons across the square. An out-of-tune brass band stumbles through a song from a distant decade. Chino nudges Jesmyn and he points as we drive by. He says, I told you, Palenque was beautiful. Defeated, we start driving back to Pacalna, back to the train tracks and the fate that is waiting for these star-crossed lovers. And for the rest of my life, I'll wish that I'd gone in the opposite direction and never taken my foot off the gas. Thank you.
I want to introduce our current Mellon Fellow, Dr. Lupe Flores, who is going to lead the Q&As.
Great. Well, we've reached the Q&A portion of the talk. So as this year's Mellon Fellow, I get the privilege and honor of asking the first question to our speaker. But first, I just want to thank you, Jason, for another great and amazing book that you've written. So thank you for that work. It's a very powerful, another powerful book. So thank you. So as anthropologists who study migration, whether in the borderlands of the Americas or even the Euro-African borderlands, we're often confronted with intense stories, intense encounters that deal with real-life people and the suffering that they endure. So my question relates to how, or an encounter or a very difficult encounter that you've had in the field, and how you were able to navigate that, and not just navigate it or process it, but also then eventually decide to write about it, right? And so I think, I think if you can share a little bit of that process. I know in your book you have these moments where you're going through these intense policing encounters, for example, and then you kind of, you sit with it and you sometimes cry, right? Yeah. So I think that would be a good place to start.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for it's a great question. I think, no one told me that, like, I went to college to become an anthropologist. I don't know. I mean, partly because I wanted to be Indiana Jones, and then when I decided that I wanted to kind of figured out that that's not how it works. I was still doing it, and then when I sort of reinvented myself as an ethnographer because I really wanted to understand, the human condition and people's experiences. No one ever told me that it was going to be really hard. Like, I felt like I was lied to. I'd read all these ethnographies where everybody just had it kind of figured out. Like, it was great. They talked to me. I learned all this cool stuff. You read Malinowski, you're like, oh, he's just hanging on an island, and the locals love him, whatever. And then you read the diaries, and it's like, he's like, I hate it here. They hate me, and I hate them, and it's like awful. And I'm like, I think people have a lot of these intense, conflicted kind of feelings and these moments that really can send you into a tailspin. And when I started this work and was having those moments, I realized that everybody has them. We oftentimes think about them as like a failure of some sort, and so we want to hide failure. And I think for me, failure is so important. I learn from failure, and I hope that others can learn through my own. If I write about my own failures and how I'm kind of working through it, and so, but I had to figure that on my own. And I will say with this book, I mean, I didn't, after my first book, I did not want to write about migrants anymore. My first book was about people who die in the Arizona desert. It really ends with the story of a 15-year-old kid named Jose Maria Takuri who disappeared in the desert. I'd spent a lot of time interviewing his parents, and never in my life have I witnessed the grief that parents will hold when a child has disappeared and they don't know what has happened. I mean, so that like broke me. And I was like, I'm gonna study, like, I don't know, Dodgers baseball, or guitars. Like, I wanted to do something totally different and not so kind of doom and gloom. And I'd gone to Mexico in 2015, and at that point I was like, okay, no more migration. I'm shifting. I'm going to work on something totally unrelated to that. And my wife was running a field school, and I was going to run one too, as kind of my goodbye to migration. And so we went down to Chiapas, and then I met this kid Roberto, who I got really close with, and I learned so much from him, and I was interviewing him a lot, and we became very friendly. And then he gets murdered at the end of that field season, and that sent me just on a tailspin. I mean, where I was like, maybe I can, it's like, I think in our household, it's the goat farm. Maybe we'll get a goat farm, and I'll just be a goat farmer. Or I think goats are a lot more work than one would imagine. But I was just like, I can't do this anymore. I don't want to be an anthropologist anymore. I don't want to, like, I just don't think I have it in me. And then I really had to take stock of a lot of things. And, I had promised him that I was going to try to write this story. And so I think, as difficult as his death was, and all the things that came from me trying to understand it, it was, I thought about it in terms of, if I don't tell his story, then he just gets to disappear, and he gets to be a nobody like everyone always thought he was. And so I think in a lot of ways he changed me and made me rethink about what it means to be an anthropologist. I mean, I think for me, it became about empathy, much more than even my first project. And I was able to kind of take this difficult, dark thing and try to use the energy from that in a I would hope a forward moving and somewhat positive way. But I really wish someone in the beginning had said to me in like a intro to anthropology course, like, if you go and do ethnography, it's really hard, and you should get a therapist. Like, because people like, you're going to go to the field, bad things are going to happen, you're going to come back, no one's going to be there to kind of support you, so you got to figure out how to find that. And I think that most many ethnographers, I think, go through similar things, and no one's talking about those difficulties. And so that's, for me, has been a new commitment too, is just to talk about the problems that one encounters and how we can try to live through it and work through it, and keep doing the work on a daily basis, even when it gets really, really tough.
Thank you. So we can open up the floor for questions for anyone who has questions or comments. Sorry, 1 second. Yeah, they gave the mic, and then we'll go to you.
I think your writing is beautiful. I'm an anthropologist also. If I could write like that, it would be just wonderful. But I think one of the most important things that you do in your books is put some context on migration, in the sense of why people are leaving Salvador, why they are leaving Honduras, why people are terrified to live in their villages, and the extent of extortion, murder, and violence, and how our policies intersect with that and the smugglers. And I don't think we're doing anything that, or maybe you have some suggestions about how we can possibly address that kind of migratory impetus that people are having.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think, I mean, for me, context is always so important. I mean, people talk about like what's the difference between ethnography and journalism. You know, I say, well, like ethnography, anthropology, we try to give a lot more context to these things, and we don't have the deadline. We're not working on this kind of tight deadline, and we have a lot more. We have a higher word count to be able to provide as much information as possible, and and I think for the anthropologists in the room, right, we're all really good at overly complicating everything. People want us to give you simple answers, and we say, well, the world's a very complicated place, and here's my 200-point response to your question about how do we fix this thing, you know. But it's important to understand the broader context, because I think in doing so, we can then begin to understand that there's no quick fix for this. Even though, you know, politicians throw quick fixes at us all the time, and one of the reason that they fall flat is because they don't work. But you know, the context is so crucial, and I think for me lately, the other part of it is it's really challenging to tell a new story about migration or about the border. I mean, I look at these stories about, you know, the Darien Gap or the U.S.-Mexico border, and most of the time I go, I can't. I mean, even though it's like my bread and butter, I won't read it because I go, I already know this story, right? It's like it's just the same tropes over and over and over again, and so if that's my response, and I'm like deeply interested in this, I can't imagine what the general public's response is. I mean, of course they're not going to read that stuff because they already think they know it too, and so the goal has to be to try to tell them a new story about this thing that they think they already know all about. And I think anthropology is uniquely suited to. I mean, we're the weirdos. We look at the world in such a fascinating ways that I think using that to present this thing that is somehow familiar and making it strange, right, or making the strange familiar, which is, you know, kind of saying within the discipline. But I think we can do that around these migration stories, and also give a lot more context so that people can walk away from it and go, huh, there's a lot more there than I was kind of imagining. And I think more importantly, and maybe this is for me the anthropological commitment, is that I don't want to tell stories about the border. I don't want to tell stories about migrants or smugglers. I want to tell stories about people who happen to be migrating, who happen to be smuggling at some point, but who aren't wholly defined by those categories, and who are much more. So that the general reader can pick it up and look at it and see themselves, or see a different version of this thing that they've been presented in ways that's oftentimes way monolithic. But that's why I love being an anthropologist, because we get to be weird and we get to spend a lot more time kind of working through these complicated stories.
So my question is, how do you fix all of this? I'm kidding. That's not my question. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. What do you see a lot of female, women, girls smuggling, doing the work of smugglers in your experience?
So women are around. It used to be that women, I think, were a lot more involved when it was a kind of mom and pop industry, and now that it's gotten a lot more intertwined with transnational. I mean, basically, cartels control geographic nodes like in Mexico, and so you know you come through Tierra Blanca, you're paying money to a cartel, and so they control those nodes. And then transnational gangs like MS-13, who I worked a lot with those guys, and then I worked quite a bit with the group of Afro-Honduran Garifuna speakers, who were all Bloods, who were really based in the Bronx. Those folks control the train tracks, so they're moving along, and they're the kind of negotiating with the cartels, and that tends to be men. Women now in this context tend to run the safe houses. And so you have to get to a place, and you have to have someone who's paying the rent, someone who's got a clean ID, who can go pick up money from Western Union, who can deal with some of the logistics. And so they're there. It was really hard for me to access that as a man. I have a graduate student she is Honduran, and she's working on this question about what is the role that women are doing. But it was always, so I write about a few women in the book, and there's one a woman that I call Alma who was involved in smuggling, and she was mostly someone who would be kind of a lookout. So if you came into Pacalna and you hadn't paid the head tax, she knew about it and then would rat you out to the scary people who would then kidnap you, would take you in there and make you pay the money or extort your family. So she was sort of doing that. That was kind of her role. But when I tried to get to talk to these other women, like even the safe houses were super gendered spaces. And so I would go to a safe house in Mexico City. I'd be with a crew of smugglers. They would put all the migrants in one room, and I tended to avoid talking to migrants when they're being smuggled because they were already so vulnerable. I did not want to make things worse for them. So they'd be in one room. The male smugglers would be in another, and then the women would be sort of there, but they would be doing their kind of own thing. And they would always joke to me. The women would say, "When you're done talking to these idiots and you want to learn the truth, we'll tell you the real stuff." And so I would be like, that's what I want. And so I would go and I would start to talk to these women, and then the men I was with would all get very paranoid and be like, "We knew you were a pervert," or we knew you were here for our women, but really they did not want me to know about certain elements of their business. And so there was lots of, there was limits to things that I would sort of get access to. But I think my student Wanda is having a lot more success with accessing that, those female spaces. But it's a super important part. I mean, this is a very complicated process and system, and I think I've only just kind of scratched the surface. So there's a lot more work to be done.
Is it on? Let me ask you an easy question. Talk to me about the tracks and the train. How does that all fit into the smuggling, and where geographically? And then secondly, under whose auspices do the trains operate? Thank you.
Yeah, that's an important question right now, because historically, the train, La Bestia, which is often referred to because it consumes arms and legs and takes lives. Migrants were riding on the tops of Mexican freight trains for many, many years, and they've started to really crack down on that. They put a halt to big chunks of the routes, and so people, instead of riding the tops of the trains now, are they're walking on the train tracks because it'll get them where they want to go, but they're not able to actually ride on the trains. And part of this is because these private companies were hiring security guards who were indiscriminately shooting at migrants and doing all kinds of other brutal things to folks. So that's really slowed down, and so there's only certain segments of these tracks that now have running trains that are accessible to migrants, and even that can be very tricky. There's a moment in the book where we're sitting around watching this train load up with migrants who are hopping on the back of it or getting on top, and then one of the guys says to me, "These people are so stupid. There's only like 7 cars on this train. It's only going to go maybe 2 miles down the road. It's going to stop. The Mexican Border Patrol will hop out, arrest everybody, and then they'll send it right back." And so they're kind of using it as a trap. But that being said, the Maya train now, right, in the Yucatan, which is running from the Yucatan Peninsula, from these archaeological sites all the way to Palenque, is supposed to be for tourists to use, and it'll be very interesting to see how migrants engage with that, that government-run train system, but it's one that's, conveniently, the former president of Mexico, López Obrador, he has his big rancho is in Pacalna, and the train runs right in front of it, right through his property, and so with this sort of new interest in creating tourism infrastructure, people's pockets are going to start to get padded. I have another grad student at UCLA who is working on trying to understand how migrants are engaging with this new train system, and so that's kind of still to be determined. But and I haven't been on it yet. New York Times had a really good article about it a few months ago about how people weren't riding on it. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars for this train system that's like a quarter full every day. So it'll be interesting to see what that does to the tourism industry, but also the migrants who are directly intersecting with that transportation system.
So, and after we have 2 more up here.
Thank you for your talk. It has been fascinating, and you alluded to how migrants are often, they start out as smugglers, but they become traffickers or they become involved in the trafficking. Is there any sense of how prevalent this is, or how, what percentage of smugglers become victims of trafficking?
You know, that's a good question, and it's one that it's all these things are really hard to get numbers on. I mean, like I could imagine trying to do a survey with traffickers, like, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, right? I mean, so there's all but we have all these like important research questions that are just like it's like so hard to know. But my sense with the trafficking is that it's a pretty small market because you know, most smugglers are not involved in human trafficking. I think for many reasons. One, most smugglers are kind of low level, you know, kind of foot soldiers who are coming in and out of the occupation. Where trafficking, there's a lot of money to be made in it, and it's a lot more organized than the day-to-day smuggling. I mean, most of the guys I work with, you could think about them as like subcontractors. So they're on the train tracks. They meet a guy who has a connection to a smuggler in Honduras. That the guy in Honduras calls the guy in Palenque. He says, "Okay, we got 5 people we want to move." The guy in Palenque finds some teenager and he says, "I'll pay you this much money to do this work for me." That kid gets arrested, dies. It doesn't matter. There's a new kid to fill that spot quickly. And so that system just keeps going without any real like kind of firm structure. The trafficking, I think, is so much more complicated. You have to be greasing more wheels. You got to be moving people against their will, which is a lot more challenging. You know, you're locking them up in various kinds of ways, keeping them imprisoned. And so I think because of that, the folks who are doing it are really tied to like transnational drug cartels. And so I'd say it's a very small percentage of folks who are doing the day-to-day smuggling who end up doing the trafficking stuff. And because even the folks who do the day-to-day smuggling, they don't do it for very long because it is so dangerous, and that you either die or you get arrested. And if you're lucky, you can get away from this stuff. But you know, most of those folks try to do the smuggling for a short amount of time, make a little bit of money, and then move on, do something different. Whereas I think that the trafficking, it's higher paid but way more dangerous, and you really have to be like aligned with some of these criminal organizations in ways that the low level guys just aren't.
There's a question over here.
Thank you. I resonated with what you said about the disconnect. I'm a human geographer and I work with the Rohingya in Bangladesh, and I lived out there for about 6 years, and it is really difficult to explain what you've seen when you come back to like grocery stores that have food and crosswalks and things that you just, you know, it's like a whole nother planet. And I wanted to understand a little bit more about your process of how, like when you're with people for years and you see what they're going through and you know their kids, like I struggle with the disconnect, like coming back and then just like having a Facebook relationship with people, and the struggle of like getting all their stories and then using it and being like, I published an article and I have all your stories in it and I did a PhD and now I'm gonna do this thing, and they're still sitting in the refugee camp. Like that struggle is just like long-term heartbreak. And how do it makes me not want to do it anymore, but I also want to do it.
I can hear the like anthropologists in the room like, oh God, yeah, I know what they said. I mean, I think if you do this kind of work and you don't live with guilt about doing it, I think that you should be. I mean, because it's for as good as we want to be ethically in the field, all these things, this is an extractive process. I mean, nobody that I wrote about got to sit at the table at the National Book Awards. I was trying to figure out if that would have been really hilarious. But it's just not a possibility, you know? And I think, and for me, people give so much to you. And I think I've tried very hard to give as much back as I possibly can and to really stay connected to folks in a way. I mean, like, it's an emotional connection. It's often a financial connection. I mean, there's people that I write about in my first book who I'm basically the health insurance for some of those folks, and that's a commitment that I'll have for the rest of my life. But it's also a commitment that that's really hard sometimes because, like, I'm not that person's parent, or there's a person that I write about in my first book who was on death's door from drinking. We did a whole bunch of things. I mean, we got him into detox, and everything was going really great, and it was doing really well for several years, and now it's worse than ever before. And I'm struggling to figure out what my role is in this whole thing. How much more can I kind of be there for this person? At what point can I step away? Do I have to step away? But I live with a lot of guilt about all this stuff, and I think that the way that I've rationalized a lot of it is and it's funny, like when I wrote the first book and I went and brought it to all these folks and showed it to them, and they were the first thing that you're like, they're going to be so stoked on this, and they were like, "You finally finished it, huh? Like, we didn't think you was even. We thought we didn't think it was going to happen, And it's like, here's the book, and my buddy Memo says, well, if anyone reads this book and they want to know the real stuff, just give them my number. They can come over here for dinner. We'll tell all that kind of stuff. And I think that over the years that he's come to understand, and a lot of these other folks understand, that like maybe the best thing that I can give them is to try to represent them as much as I can as whole individuals. I mean, I want people to love them and to like them, or in the case of Soldiers and Kings, to feel as complicated a set of emotions as I do about these folks, so that they can be heard. And I think that's that. I mean, I'm obviously doing this other stuff that I'm trying to like support them in different ways, but I think at the end of the day, it was really trying to have them be seen. And I think if I had to break it down, like, so when my friend Roberto was murdered, and I just didn't know what I was going to do, the book for me, I think I've come to this realization that I only wrote the book so that I could bring him back to life in the last paragraph of that book, and he gets to live forever, and I get to think about him in that way. Other people get to think about him in that way, and that was like he'd given me so much, and that was like, okay, this is what I can give to you. And I think with all these folks, we just try to find ways that we can do right by them. But man, oh man, sitting in a marketing meeting about a book, or being in a classroom and talking about it's just a hard thing. And I think that the way that the other thing that I do is just to be as open and honest about this stuff as I possibly can, and to say, you know what, I feel super guilty. You know what, like, this stuff is hard, and I'm conflicted, and it's extractive, and I'm making a product that has to be then that's being bought and sold. And what does that mean as a researcher? As all these things, I don't have the answers, I think, for that, but I definitely am an oversharer about all this stuff, and I think it's important to at least cop to it, and then hopefully come to a better place with it, because I think we all struggle with it as like social science researchers who are working with human subjects.
You sort of answered my question, but ideally, if you had your way, what is it that you would love to accomplish by going through these experiences? Because you're putting yourself at harm's way. You're, meeting people, and you're going through these very difficult situations, writing these books, telling us the stories. What is it that you would love to accomplish with all of this?
I always like to tell this story. When I was in graduate school, I was miserable. My first semester in graduate school, I moved from LA to Penn State. Penn State's great. It's in the middle of nowhere. It is not Los Angeles. I broke up with a girlfriend. I was living by myself in the middle of the wood. I was living in this sad, lonely apartment. It was me and my cat, and like a card table. I mean, that was it. It was a very sad existence, and I was just struggling to be a student, and I was going through it. And so I went to group therapy for graduate students, and we're kind of going around the room, and we're talking about what people are like. Why are you here? What's your struggle? And someone, I'll never forget, this guy said something like, I'm here because I'm working on a project that is going to figure out how to purify salt water at a very cheap rate, and I'm going to solve the like famine problem in Africa, and that keeps me up at night. And I was like, I'm sad because I broke up with a girlfriend and I live in the woods, and I was like that's I was like, man, that's a lot to put on yourself, and that was to think about with all this work, I try to not have very lofty goals about it. Like nothing that I do is going to change the world, and all that I can hope for is to leave it a little bit better than how I found it. And I think in trying to do that on a daily basis and just some good deed today. And for me, it's really about empathy. I think right now, I mean, we can educate people about the border and all this stuff, but sometimes it's like if I tell you that 5,000 people have died crossing the Arizona desert in the last 30 years, and you don't even blink. Is that because you're not educated about these policies, or is there an empathy problem, right? And so for me, part of the work is just really trying to create more empathy in the world, and I think in the beginning as a researcher, I had an emotional connection to stuff, and I was really driven by intellectual curiosity as well, and now it's a combination of those things, but with empathy as being, I think, at the core of all of it, and I think the other part of this work, and maybe this is a little bit selfish, is I'm trying to use this work to become a better person myself too. So that I'm trying to learn. I love my job because I feel like I get to learn something every day. I get to meet new people. They radically change me. I was telling someone the other day that I didn't think that working with smugglers for almost a decade sent me back to therapy after a 20-year hiatus and forced me to deal with a whole bunch of demons, but made me a better person. Like I am the happiest I've ever been in my entire life. And I owe this to like a bunch of like maniacs that I met on the train tracks who were like, overshares too. And I really found that the endeavor of this work is something that like I go into it really open and wanting to be changed and wanting to learn. And so, I want everyone else to learn stuff and come with me for this ride. But I think selfishly, I'm also trying to find ways for me to find more empathy in myself and I would hope become a better person because of it.
May I ask the last question? I think we all would like to know what became of Chino and Jesmyn.
I don't want to spoil anything. So, yeah, that's kind of why I leave you with the, so people get mad when I ruin the ending. So,
Is it at least sort of happy or kind of in between or some?
Yeah. I mean, the book has happy endings. It's got sad endings. It's got a little bit of everything. And I think if I had to give you an ending for it, one of my favorite American novelists is a guy named Willie Valentin, who is a buddy of mine, and I'm like a huge fanboy of his work still, even though we're friends. And I love his work so much because he writes these really heartbreaking stories about the American West, about working class folks, and you're really rooting for these folks who are just struggling in so many ways. And every one of his books ends like in this way where you're like that's it, like he didn't get the girl, she didn't win the lottery. It's like no, it's just kind of like she's still alive, but has to go to work tomorrow, still hates her job, kind of thing. And I liked it. I like that because that's often how life is, right? It's like it doesn't get wrapped up nice in a bow. There's happy types of endings, happier endings, but it's not like the happy ending. And I think I really appreciate that because I feel like that really speaks more to the reality that all of us kind of live through, and on the migrant trail in this room and elsewhere. So I think the book, for me, those stories end in ways that run the full spectrum of kind of break your heart, and then also give you, I would hope, some hope at the end of the day. Thank you.
So thank everybody for coming tonight. Thanks Site Santa Fe, Lupe, Jason. Please take our schedule for our summer and spring events with you, and we hope to see you at many of those. Bye.